Hello. So this is a quick overview of one of the most famous theories of ethics, utilitarianism. Almost everybody's at least heard of utilitarianism, whether they are aware of sort of the details or not in the specific applications or not. I'm drawing a lot of this from this fantastic introductory ethics textbook from James Rachel's, where he has 2 chapters dedicated to utilitarianism. All right, so setting the stage, right? So what's going to happen, I'm going to kind of build up the theory from its pieces and then explain a few straightforward applications of the theory, like how does the theory actually get used? Okay, so first of all, 2 very general approaches to forming an ethical theory. The first one is maybe a little more straightforwardly named consequentialism. So it's focusing only on the consequences of our actions. When we're trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, what do we pay attention to? The consequences of our actions. It doesn't really matter, according to this approach, it doesn't really matter how we get to those consequences, as long as the consequences are good. Right? We're maximizing the good consequences, minimizing the bad consequences, and then we're doing the right thing. On the other hand, we have deontology, which instead of focusing on consequences, it ignores the consequences. And instead, such a theory says that there's specific actions that are always going to be right or always going to be wrong, and it doesn't really matter what the consequences are. You know, follow the rule. And if as long as you're following the rule in the proper way, then you know you're doing the right thing. Well, utilitarianism is probably the most famous, actually it definitely is by a long shot, the most famous consequentialist theory of ethics. So it's going to focus just on the consequences. Okay, so then that's one big pillar of the theory. Here's another big pillar of the theory. This distinction between intrinsic value and extrinsic value. So first of all, value just has to do with sort of what we think is good, what should be preserved or pursued or maintained or created. You know, what's the ultimate goal of ethics? What are we aiming at? And so those kinds of things, that's an intrinsically valuable thing, sort of the ultimate final goal that we're really aiming at, something that's valuable in and of itself. On the other hand, we have extrinsic value. And something that has extrinsic value is valuable only insofar as it can lead to or promote or maximize intrinsic value. So if there's no intrinsic value, that's sort of the goal that's leading, that's in the future there, then the thing we've got now has no value whatsoever. It doesn't have any intrinsic value. That's maybe a little confusing just to say it in a general and the abstract like that. So here's some examples. The most straightforward example of something with extrinsic value is just money, right? Currency. You know, think of, you know, a little lump of metal or a strip of papery fabric. There's nothing about those things in themselves that makes them valuable. They're just objects with no value at all. But if you can use those objects to actually buy something that then leads to something that's valuable somehow, you know, you can use that money to get you on the road to something that's intrinsically valuable. So that's sort of the classic example of the extrinsic value of money, right? So if there's nothing to buy, right? So you're stranded on a deserted island, but you have a big pile of cash. It's like, well, who cares about that cash? You could maybe use it to start a fire or something. But otherwise, it's valueless because it doesn't have any ability to help you to get anything that has intrinsic value. Okay. Classic example of something with intrinsic value is happiness. And actually, that's going to be one of the central things in utilitarianism, as we'll see. So happiness is intrinsically valuable because if you just sort of think about the feeling of happiness itself, forget about why you are happy, you know, what's made you happy, forget about sort of where that happiness is leading, or maybe if you're real happy, you might neglect your duties somehow, you know, you're just not paying attention to anything else. Don't worry about any of that external stuff. Just focus on that pure feeling of happiness itself. Not where it came from, not where it's going, just the happiness. It just is a positive. right? Happiness by itself just is a positive feeling. So this is why we think that it has intrinsic value. It is a valuable thing to be pursuing, to have as your goal, to be maximizing or preserving happiness. It's just as a good thing in the world. More happiness maybe is better. So happiness is one of the less controversial things that has intrinsic value. On the other hand, think of suffering, just that feeling of suffering. Again, forget about what's causing you to suffer, forget about what you're going to learn from that suffering or where it's going to lead you or any of that stuff. Just that pure, in the moment itself, feeling of suffering. It just is a negative feeling. It's bad. That's sort of almost like what we think of as suffering. It's just a bad feeling. Maybe it helps you to learn, maybe it leads to improvement or something like that, but set that aside. Just the feeling of the suffering itself is intrinsically bad. So it's got intrinsic negative value, as opposed to happiness has intrinsic positive value. Okay, so according to utilitarianism, famously, the only thing with intrinsic value is happiness. The only thing with intrinsic positive value is happiness. And then the only thing with intrinsic negative value is suffering. There might be lots of other things that you think are valuable. So I use the example of money, but that one's easy. That's clearly extrinsically valuable. But when I present this to my classes, people might suggest something like, well, food and water, that's really valuable, extremely important. But then I ask, so what's so important about food? What's so important about water? You know, just water by itself. It's just H2O, right? So what's the big deal? Well, it's important to us because we need it in order to stay alive. So when we find ourselves saying like, so what's so important about this candidate thing that has value? And we say, well, it's important because it helps us to, well, then we immediately show that what we're talking about is extrinsic value, right? It's valuable because it helps us to get something else, or it helps us to preserve or promote or maximize something else. So that has extrinsic value. Food, water, air, you know, those kinds of things, all extrinsically valuable. So then people might say, oh, well, maybe it's life then. Maybe life is intrinsically valuable. Food and water and air, those are needed to preserve life. And so that's why those things are extrinsically valuable. This is where the utilitarian starts to break with some sort of traditions that would say that life itself is valuable. Utilitarianism does not say that life itself is intrinsically valuable, interestingly. It's just the happiness that can result from being alive and that living things can feel, living and conscious. Feeling things can feel, as they call them, sentient things. So a sentient being, according to utilitarianism, is just any being that can feel happiness and suffering. So just being alive, according to utilitarianism, is not valuable unless you can feel happiness. If you can't feel any happiness, like there's just no chance of feeling any happiness for you now or in the future, then according to utilitarianism, there's no value left. Not even extrinsic value in this straightforward way, at least, that you know, you're not alive in order to be able to feel happiness or anything. If there's no happiness there, then there's no value there. Okay. So I said this, right? Happiness is the only intrinsically valuable thing. The only intrinsically bad thing, or the only thing with intrinsic negative value, is suffering, which is sort of the opposite of pain. I'm sorry, the opposite of happiness. Okay, so we take all that. The only intrinsically good thing is happiness and consequentialism. So then we should do what has the consequences of increasing happiness. That's sort of the rough and ready sense of utilitarianism. Here's a somewhat more precise way of expressing what utilitarianism is telling us. So always do whatever will have the consequence of maximizing total happiness and minimizing total suffering. That may or may not be promoting happiness in the majority of people. You know, that's often the way it might play out, but it could be that some people end up suffering a little, maybe even a lot of people suffer a little bit in order to make a small group of people very happy, or to decrease their suffering a lot. And so it's not about the number of people involved, it's the amount of happiness and the amount of suffering that's involved. So from among your available actions, because you can't do everything, right? You can't get rid of all suffering. You're not magical in that way, right? So from among your available options, do whichever of those options has the consequence of maximizing total happiness and minimizing total suffering by the greatest amount. So who do you need to include in your consideration of these consequences? Well, all sentient beings. I mentioned this before. A sentient being is a being that can feel happiness and suffering. So you need to take them into account when considering which action to pursue. Everyone's happiness counts the same. This doesn't mean that everybody feels the same happiness or feels the same amount of suffering. It just means that no individual person's happiness and suffering is automatically more important than somebody else's. So if I'm the one that's deciding what the right thing to do is, then I can't say that my personal happiness or my personal suffering is the most important thing. No, I'm on an even playing field with everybody else. And so there might be a situation where I need to give up my own happiness and maybe even make myself suffer a little bit in order to maximize total happiness and minimize total suffering in the world to the best of my ability, right? Like I said, I can't solve everything. I can't make everybody happy and eliminate all suffering. It's just, you know, what options I actually have reasonably available for me to actually do. Then I should do whatever will maximize happiness and minimize suffering to the greatest extent. So all your options are sort of laid out, and for each option, you try to get as best as you can a sense of how much happiness will be caused by each of those options, how much suffering will be caused by each of those options, and then pick the option that has the best balance of happiness over suffering. So there's a sense in which utilitarianism is a pretty straightforward and simple ethical theory. Just do this, right? Maximize happiness and minimize suffering as best you can. And again, getting back to this one here, you know, everybody's happiness counts the same. This definitely doesn't mean that everybody gets treated the same. So an example I usually bring up in my classes is suppose there's only one piece of candy left. And it's between me and another adult, like there's only us two. So the question is like, who gets the candy? Well, what does utilitarianism have to say about this? Assuming there's nothing else special, we're just like average everyday adults. Well, we flip a coin, really. I get the candy, you get the candy. Seems like the same amount of happiness and suffering is going to result either way. So we just flip a coin. On the other hand, what if the choice is between me and a 3-year-old child? And now we have to decide who gets the candy. Well, now things are different, right? Because the child has more intense feelings about this. So if I show them the candy and then I'm like, I get it, sorry, you lose out. Well, the kid might feel actually quite a lot of suffering, right? If I don't get the candy, whatever. Like I kind of like candy. If it's chocolate, then maybe that's a slightly different story. But even then, like I'll suffer just a teeny bit, really. It kind of makes no difference to me ultimately. So my suffering is teeny tiny. My happiness, yeah, like I get some happiness out of eating this if it's a kind of dessert that I like. But still, like my happiness is not going to be that dramatic. But for the 3-year-old child, they feel it very strongly, right? So their happiness at getting the last piece of candy might be pretty dramatic. And then on the other side, their suffering of knowing that they were deprived that last piece of candy, they might just collapse, right? Just collapse in just a heap of suffering. And so the utilitarian answer is very clear here. Give the candy to the kid, right? That will maximize happiness and minimize suffering in this situation. Okay, so that's an easy example. And for most easy examples, utilitarianism gives us the straightforward, intuitively correct answer. You know, don't torture, right? Don't torture people, even if that kind of makes you happy, to torture people. Like your happiness might go up by a little bit, but other people's suffering will go up by a huge amount. So you will not be minimizing suffering and maximizing happiness overall by torturing people. So you can't do that. So it matches a lot of our intuitive conclusions that we come without sort of thinking of any ethical theory from philosophers. Utilitarianism matches our intuitions. A more dramatic one would be slavery, right? Clearly the slaves are suffering a lot. And so alleviating their suffering would be sort of the dramatically correct answer here, according to utilitarianism. Yes, perhaps the slave owners or other people that are benefiting from the system of slavery, their suffering might go up a little bit, their happiness might come down a little bit, but compared to the happiness and suffering difference on the part of the slaves or the recently freed people, the answer is clear from the point of view of utilitarianism. And that's true even if there's only a few slaves, right? And even if they're treated fairly well. Because remember, utilitarianism says, from among your available options, do whatever will maximize happiness and minimize suffering to the greatest extent. So even if there's some sort of fantastical situation where the slaves are well treated somehow, and there's really not that many of them, still there's the alternative situation of no slaves at all. And that will do an even better job of maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. And so utilitarianism basically says no slavery, right? And so again, that matches our intuitions about that scenario. Just the basic good aspects of utilitarianism. I'll present the problems in another presentation. But yeah, it's hard to deny that happiness and suffering are important. Suffering is bad, happiness is good. So it seems to get that right. We also intuitively think that the consequences of our actions are important when making moral decisions here. But you need to take that into account. You need to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions. And as I was just describing, it matches many of our very strongest intuitions. So the theory sort of gets it right in that regard. And then also, just as sort of an interesting aside, but something that is kind of true, is that a lot of government policies, presumably, right? I mean, we have lots of complaints about government, catering to the super wealthy or to whatever other special interests or something. But sort of, basic governance, what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to minimize suffering among the citizens and increase their happiness, increase their well-being, right? So this is sort of a general guideline for government policies. In fact, there is a government, I should have looked this up, the name of the government, but in Central Asia, that is, I think it's Burma, actually, that is in their constitution that the government is required to keep track of their citizens' happiness levels, and the government has a mandate to increase or at least maintain the happiness level of their citizens. And so that's obviously a very utilitarian policy that's built into their constitution. All right, so thanks, I'll go ahead and stop there.